And as the fighting continues on the ground and tensions continue to escalate, Western allies have been stepping up their diplomatic campaign to try and isolate Moscow. The United Nations General Assembly session witnessed it was the first such session in 40 years, a rare emergency session, only the 11th in United Nations history. It opened with the members observing a minute of silence for Ukraine.
Or meditation.
The Assembly President Abdullah Shahid called for an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine and for all parties to exercise maximum restraint. He also urged both sides for a full return to diplomacy and dialogue.
We are all gravely concerned about the fast deteriorating situation and ongoing military action in Ukraine. As I emphasized last week, the military offensive by the Russian Federation is a violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and is inconsistent with the Charter of the United Nations. Today I renew my call for an immediate ceasefire, for all parties to exercise maximum restraint and for a full return to diplomacy and dialogue.
The United Nations Secretary General urged for the fighting to stop and for all UN members to live up to the principles of the Charter. The UN also appointed a crisis coordinator for Ukraine and allocated $20 million for emergency operations.
Although Russian strikes are reportedly largely targeting Ukrainian military facilities, we have credible accounts of residential buildings, critical civilian infrastructure, and other non-military targets sustaining heavy damage. This escalating violence, which is resulting in civilian deaths, including children, is totally unacceptable. Enough is enough.
Meanwhile, Belarus renounced its non-nuclear status. The UN Secretary General said that the idea of a nuclear conflict is inconceivable.
Fighting in Ukraine must stop. It's raging across the country from air, land and sea. It must stop now. Russian missile and air bombardments have been pounding Ukrainian cities day and night. The capital, Kyiv, is encircled from all sides. In the face of the continuing attacks, Kyiv's 3 million residents are being forced to seek safety in their homes, improvised bomb shelters, and the city's subways. The Ukrainian government has distributed a meaningful number of arms to the population with the stated objective to participate in the defense of the country.
Opening his address at the General Assembly, the Ukrainian ambassador waved a screenshot from his phone showing what he claims is a conversation of a soldier with his mother, where the soldier informs his mother that there are civilians throwing themselves before tanks. The Ukrainian ambassador accused Russia of killing hundreds of Ukrainians. The ambassador added that Russia is mounting an offensive while negotiations were still underway. Ukraine also called Russia's nuclear alert threat madness, quote-unquote. Our correspondent Susan Teherani has been tracking all those developments from the United Nations headquarters. Susan, the UN president urging countries to quote-unquote give peace a chance, but unfortunately for now it looks like peace is a distant dream. Take us through the key takeaways from the United Nations session right now.
Right, the session really started with a plea for peace, as you described accurately and very thoroughly, Molly, by the UN General Assembly President, and then immediately after by the Secretary General, once again calling for a cessation of violence and also calling for peace, but also really pleading on the international front for a humanitarian crisis to end, as well as we're seeing refugees really coming out of the country and going to neighboring countries. The UN estimates about 500,000 refugees right now are at hand, and it is what we expected, really. First, a call for a cessation of violence, drawing attention to the humanitarian crisis, and also calling on Russia to adhere to the UN Charter, which is for peace and stability. But also we heard, as you mentioned, from the Ukrainian side, we heard the Russians really bring their side of the story to the table as well. And then we heard from the European Unions and also Denmark and then Britain, mostly from Western countries, really calling out Russia for its quote-unquote aggression against the Ukrainians. But also, I think what's important is what the General Assembly really can achieve today, and that's an all-out condemnation and a call for a halt to the violence. But it was interesting of how harsh words from the Ukrainian and the Russian sides were, unfortunately, considering the fact that we do know that both sides were in Belarus trying to reach some sort of deal, a ceasefire deal, although no one was really optimistic that anything would be reached. But as that was taking place, these harsh words were being leveled against one another here at the United Nations.
Right. Susan, help us better understand the humanitarian assistance that has already been committed by the United Nations.
Right. That was something that the Secretary General outlined during his speech. He said that there were about $20 million that was already being committed from the emergency fund of the United Nations, and more is going to be allocated. And the reason that he was really bringing out these numbers to the General Assembly, what's important is, while the General Assembly is not really an action committee, but it does approve budgets, notably humanitarian budgets. So it was important for that aspect of the Secretary General's speech to be laid out against the 193 member states. And then later on, while a lot of condemnation and a lot of speeches have been taking place here, and perhaps the UN has been facing criticism that it hasn't really been able to practically stop Russia. But later on today, there is hope that there will be a UN Security Council meeting in the afternoon at around 3 p.m. local time, put forth by France and Mexico. And that meeting is going to focus on giving humanitarian aid and granting humanitarian aid to Ukraine amidst this crisis. And that is, again, something that practically will perhaps help the people of Ukraine at this time and will garner a lot more support than perhaps verbally condemning Russia for its aggressions against Ukraine, which some countries chose to abstain, and some countries perhaps did not take the stance that the West hoped that it would. But when it comes to the humanitarian aid, I think we'll see more action coming from the UN, which really is where its strengths lie at the end of the day. We've seen in other countries as well.
Right. Susan Tehrani, we're leaving it there for the moment. Thanks very much for joining us with those updates. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.